If you currently have a Mac device and you're looking forward to getting a high-res external monitor for your computer, you've probably heard that when it comes to macOS scaling, that is not the best, and in fact you should return it and get the Apple Studio display that costs almost an arm and a leg since it works best with macOS scaling. But that's not entirely true, and in fact in this video I'm going to tell you all there is to know when it comes to 4K monitors, 1440p and 1080p, and explain more what macOS scaling does, and I'll make it so simple so that even our grandparents will be able to understand what I'm explaining. In order to experience this for myself and make it make sense for you, I've actually gone out and I've bought 3 monitors, and they are all the same size. So 27 inch is a pretty standard size now going forward for a lot of personal uses when it comes to external monitors. So I bought a brand new 27-inch 4K monitor. It's LG. I also have a 27-inch 1440p monitor, and I have another 27-inch 1080p monitor. Scaling is defined as a feature that adjusts the different UI or user interface elements on macOS to make them readable. So scaling adjusts the size of text, size of icons, and other elements on the screen to make them appear larger or smaller depending on the display's resolution and user preference. Also, when it comes to scaling on the macOS, it ensures that everything looks sharp and is readable, especially on high resolution monitors like a 4K 27-inch monitor. One of the major things that macOS looks at when it's scaling a particular display to make it work best for macOS is look at the PPI or pixels per inch that a display has, and then it will take into account the amount or the total amount of pixels that external monitor has and scale the user interface accordingly. What you are seeing here is the screen capture on my 27-inch 1080p monitor, and of course if I go into the system preferences, go to the display and select this 27-inch 1080p panel, you can see here that the maximum default resolution that macOS sets our 27-inch 1080p panel is the default native resolution, which is 1920 by 1080p. And in fact, if we click on the Apple logo right here and then hold down the option key, you can see it turns to system information, and if we click on system information and go down to where it says display and graphics right there, you can see my 27-inch 1080p panel, and it's the HP27ER, and you can see the default resolution that macOS is identifying this display at is 1920 by 1080p, and of course this is the default native panel resolution. And you can see how macOS is putting out the user interface. It says UI looks like 1920 by 1080p, which is this default resolution that you see that macOS sets by default for a 27-inch 1080p panel. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can see how my different windows look like. So for example, my system setting window, because the default macOS for a 27-inch 1080p panel is 1920 by 1080p as the default, you can see the size of my window right here, and you can see the size of my system information. So what I'm going to do is take the same window size from this 1080p panel and take it to my other 27-inch 1440 panel. So dragging the window over right here, you can see how the window has changed size, and this is the display that I'm now showing. It's the one that I'm capturing, and at the same time, if I was to go and get my system information window and bring it to my 27-inch 1440p panel, you can see how that looks side by side. If I press Command R and just refresh my system information page right here, you can see that this is the monitor that I'm looking at, is my Sansui 1440p 180 hertz panel that I'm looking at right here. And you can see if you have a 27-inch 1440p panel, by default macOS will make the display look like 2560 by 1440, which is the native resolution of the display itself. So there is no message saying that this will affect performance or any impact on the GPU by itself. And if you look at how macOS is making it look, you can see the panel resolution 2560 by 1440, and the UI looks like 2560 by 1440 at 180 Hertz. One of the things you might have noticed, of course, is the window sizes, like I highlighted when we went from the 1080p monitor to the 1440p monitor. So now what I'm about to do is plug in my 4K monitor and then see how macOS scales the UI and makes the interface look. So I'm going to take the same two windows and drag them here to my 4K monitor that you can see. Now if I drag this other window, you can see how it looks right here. So this window, or the screen that you are now seeing here, is that of my 4K monitor, and it's this RG ultrafine that you can see right here. You can see the panel has a maximum resolution of 3840 by 2160, so it's a 4K panel, and you can see how by default macOS scales the user interface, the different text and elements on the screen, to make it look like 1920 by 1080p. But of course, as you can tell from this 1080p on a 4K panel or 4K monitor, it looks much more fine and much more sharp because we have so much resolution compared to the 27-inch 1080p panel. And of course, if we go to our page right here on the system information, press Command and R and refresh the page right here, you can see that the new 4K monitor that I've just plugged in, the RG Ultrafine, has a resolution of 3840 by 2160, and right here you can see how macOS is scaling the UI to look like, and it's that of 1920 by 1080p at 60 Hertz, which is this default selection that we are seeing right here. And you can see the other settings right here, and I don't have any message that's saying this is going to affect GPU, because by default for a 27-inch 4K monitor, macOS scales it to 1080p. Using the three examples that I've just shown here, you can see on a 27-inch 1080p monitor, macOS makes the UI look exactly like 1080p, so there's essentially no scaling. On a 27-inch 1440p panel, macOS makes the UI look exactly like 1440p, but the moment you go at 4K and above, the macOS software scales the UI to look by default like that of a 1080p user interface. However, the text is much more sharp. In fact, macOS scaling doesn't only affect 4K monitors. Apple's very own 5K Studio display that has a resolution of 5120 by 2880 has a UI that is scaled to look like 2160 by 1440. As you can see, the UI on Apple's very own 5K Apple Studio display is not by default set to 5K, it's by default set to 1440p, and at the same time it doesn't end there. If you buy the premium, very expensive Apple Pro Display XDR that has 6K native resolution, the UI by default isn't set to 6K, and for that Pro Display XDR, the UI is scaled to look like 3008 by 1691p. The reason why Apple scales 4K monitors to look like 1080p, 5K monitors to look like 1440p, if you were to natively display 4K and make the UI look like 4K, or display 5K natively as the UI, or even worse, display 6K as the user elements or user interface, you would literally need a magnifying glass to see the different elements on the screen. This can be illustrated by this example on my LG Ultrafine 4K 27-inch monitor. Right now, if I was to scale the UI to make it look like 3840 by 2160 right there, this is literally how 4K would look like. The UI is scaled to look like 4K, and if we were to refresh this page right here, you can see, for example, the resolution is 3840 by 2160, and the UI looks like 3840 by 2160. And you can see, for example, from where I'm sitting right here, how hard it is to see text, and this is like arm's length away. So this is how it looks when the UI has been scaled to look like 4K on a 4K panel, and on a 27-inch 5K panel like the Apple Studio display, for example, if you were to scale it to 5K, this would even get smaller, so about that size, which from where I'm sitting right now is impossible to see. And worse, if you have like really bad eyesight or you are a senior, this UI is almost unbearable. And if 4K looks like this, 5K looks like that, and then 6K would be scaled to look even smaller. If I go back to the default 1920 by 1080p and then refresh this page, you can see the UI looks 1920 by 1080p. And from where I'm sitting, this is very doable. It looks sharp on this 4K panel, optimized to have the UI look like 1080p. The advantage of using this display resolution that's set by macOS for like a 4K 27-inch monitor is that you won't get a message that says changing this will affect performance. So if I select like 1152, for example, to give it a second, you can see using a scaled resolution may affect performance, and once you go back to the default set resolution, that message disappears. The same also applies if I was to drag everything right here on my 271440p panel right here. You can see the default is 1440p, and if I select another resolution, like for example 1152, using a scaled resolution may affect performance right there. So using the default resolution set for macOS makes the text look sharp, and at the same time the message that tells you that this may affect performance is not there. Now, in order to understand why macOS scales, like for example in this case 4K monitors to make them look like 1080p, and if you have like a 5K display, macOS is gonna scale it to make the UI look like this, which is going to be 1440p. And if you have a 6K display, macOS is going to scale it not to 6061 by 3038. No, the UI is going to be scaled to look like 3808 by 1691, which in this case will make the default resolution look like that of a lower resolution native panel. But because this is on a higher pixel monitor like 4K, 5K or 6K, you can see here, for example, on my 4K monitor, this 1080p looks much sharper than on a 1080p monitor scaled to 1080p. And then 2560 by 1440, the UI looks much sharper than 1440p on a 1440p monitor, which is how macOS is able to utilize the more pixels that a 4K or 5K display has to make the text look much sharper. So this is how 1440p would look on a 4K monitor. You can see the sharpness of this text and everything. And now if I was to drag this to my other 1440p 27-inch panel, this is how it basically looks. And this monitor is set to default to the maximum native resolution of 1440p, and 4K definitely looks much sharper than this. Here's something that I've never really seen anyone talk about, especially or try to explain when it comes to macOS upscaling or the 2x scaling when it comes to macOS. So if you take a 1080p panel that is 1920 by 1080p, the maximum pixels, and you times the total by 2, you would think that essentially this is supposed to give you 4K, right? Well, wrong. The total horizontal and vertical pixels in a 1920 by 1080p monitor upscaled by 2 is not exactly 4K, because if you take, for example, 1920 times 1080p right here, so 1080, and then you get the total right here, you can see this gives you about 2,073,600 pixels in a 1920 by 1080p panel, and that is both a combination of the horizontal and vertical pixels in a 1080p panel. So you get about 2,073,000. But then if you were to take a 4K panel or 4K monitor that has a total horizontal pixel of 3840 times the vertical pixels that it has, which is 2160, so you can see the total horizontal and vertical pixels you get in a 4K panel are almost 8.3 million pixels. So 1920 by 1080p, as we saw right here, is equals to approximately 2 million pixels. And then if you upscale this by 2, you don't actually get 4K. You can see you get about 4,000 pixels, which is about half of the pixels in a 4K native panel. But then if you upscale it by 2 again to upscale it in total by 4, so times 2, then you can see you get about close to 8.3 million pixels. That is the total horizontal and total pixels, which means that 1920 by 1080p has to be upscaled both the horizontal and vertical pixels 2 by 2, which gives you a 4x scaling. It's just like taking a single pixel that measures 1 by 1. The product of 1 and 1 essentially gives you 1. But if you were to take that same pixel and scale the horizontal from 1 to 2 and then the vertical from 1 to 2, the product is 2 by 2, which is 4. So if this is the case, then why is it deemed most cases when it comes to macOS 2x scaling? So in order to understand why macOS scaling is often deemed as 2x scaling, we need to understand why 4K or 3840 by 2160 in most cases is referred to as 4K. And the reason for that is because 4K has a horizontal, not the vertical, but the horizontal resolution in a 4K monitor that is from side to side. Here's about 3840 pixels, which is close to 4K. So if you are only considering just the horizontal side of the monitor of a pixel, in this case, if you're just considering the 3840 or close to 4K pixels in a horizontal monitor, then if you were just to double that side by 2 or half it, put it in half, that is why it's often deemed as 2x scaling. If you consider just either the horizontal side or the vertical side only and just double that side, you get the 2x scaling that macOS uses, which is often used in display language or when referring to certain displays and monitors. If you just take the horizontal pixels in a 4K monitor, which is 3840 divided by 2, we are just considering one horizontal side. You can see 1920, and then if you double 1920 by 2, you get 3840. At the same time, if you just take the vertical pixels in a 4K monitor, which is 2160, and then you divide it by 2, you get 1080p, which is often referred to when referring to 1920 by 1080p. But then if you take 1080p and upscale it by 2 or times it by 2, you get 2160. But this is just considering either the vertical in this case or the horizontal side of a monitor. Let's talk about the fun part when it comes to setting other resolutions on your 4K or on your 1440p or 1080p monitor with macOS. There's something that you need to see. When you go into your display setting on macOS, you want to go to this toggle that says show all resolution, and right here, if you click on show all resolution, right here you can see, like for example 1920 by 1080p, they have a default one, and at the same time they have a raw resolution one. You can see if I select the raw resolution how it looks, and if I was to go to like 1440p, you have this one that it doesn't have raw resolution in brackets. And then if you have, or if you select 1440p raw resolution, you can see how that looks. Similarly, right here on my 27-inch 1440p panel, you can see the default resolution right here. And if I click on the option that says show all resolutions right there, you can see instead of it just saying low resolution, high resolution, this one has this section that says HiDPi. And basically when selecting display settings, the HiDPi means high dots per inch, and on macOS display this settings refers to high resolution display that renders the user interface and applications at a higher pixel density. So for example, if we were to select like 720 right here on a lower pixel density, you can see how it looks on this 27-inch 1440p monitor. But then if we go to 1280 by 720, which is the same one but on the high dots per inch selection right here, you can see how much clearer the text is on my 27-inch 1440p panel, and this mode allows for sharper text and graphics, making everything look detailed and crisp. And right here you can see on my 27-inch 1080p panel, the default resolution is 1080p of course, and if I go and toggle on this option that says show all resolution, and keep in mind that I'm on macOS Sequoia, you can see we also have the same option where we have regular resolutions and we have the high dots per inch, and this high dots per inch mode uses more pixels to render the same amount of content, resulting in sharper images and text. For example, a retina display might use 4 physical pixels, that is 2 by 2, to represent what will be a single pixel on a non-retina display. That is why, for example, on this 1080p 27-inch panel, if I was to select this 576 by 1024 resolution right here and then click change resolution, you can see how the text looks. It really doesn't look sharp. And then if I select the high dots per inch equivalent and then change the resolution, you can see how much sharper the text looks. Back to our LG 27-inch 4K monitor right here, you can see the user interface is made to look like 1080p on a 4K panel, which is the maximum resolution. But then you can see the default right here is 1080p, and this doesn't even have a message that says this will affect performance, because the default rendered resolution that macOS is optimized for on a 27-inch 4K monitor is 1920 by 1080p. You can see that's why we don't get the message. But then what if you have a 4K monitor and want to have more screen real estate? For example, you want to select 1440p. You can see right here, you get this message and it will say using a scaled resolution may affect performance. And this can be seen right here because of the 2x scaling that I explained before. In order to achieve that, macOS thinks that our 4K 27-inch resolution has a native resolution of 5120 by 2880, which is 5K. And right here you can see it's now making the UI elements look like it's 2560 by 1440, and taking 1440 and timesing it by 2 or upscaling it by 2, you get 2880 if you're just looking at the vertical aspect. But then if you also are looking at the horizontal aspect, it's also taking 2560 and then timesing it by 2 and then giving us this 51 by 20, thereby achieving this 2x scaling because we've set our resolution to 1440. At the same time, if you select any other resolution right here and then refresh this page, you can see here macOS thinks that our resolution is 6016 by 3384, and because of that it's taking this and upscaling it by 2 to give us this native resolution that it thinks our 4K monitor is. And it's always going to do that 2x upscaling for all these resolutions that you see here, like even 1890. If we refresh this page, you can see how our resolution looks, and it's making the UI look like this. The only one where it's not going to scale besides the default that we have is the native panel resolution on a 4K monitor, which is 3840 by 2160. So if we select that and then refresh this page, you can see the resolution is 3840 by 2160 and the UI is made to look 3840 by 2160. So this native resolution won't be upscaled, or it won't do any 2x scaling. And at the same time, on either a 4K monitor or a 1440p or 1080p monitor, if you select a resolution that is the low one, so in the 4K monitor, if I select, like for example, this 1440p raw resolution right here and then refresh this page, you can see there is no upscaling or 2x scaling that's going on with macOS. It thinks my panel resolution is 1440p and it's making my UI look like it's 1440p. At the same time, if I select this one that is 1296 and refresh the page, you can see there is no upscaling that's going on. So if I was to select any of these low resolution options that you see on a 4K monitor, there's literally no 2x scaling that's going to take place. But then if you were to select like this one that doesn't have the raw resolution on the side and refresh the page, you can see that it's going to be upscaling. In order to get the best user experience, you don't want to select the one that has low resolution in brackets or on the side. If you have an older monitor or an older display that is 1440p or that is 1080p, you always want to select the option that says high DPI or high dots per inch, as that's what's going to give you the best resolution and display on your different monitors. The big question now is, how does using a scaled or a non-default rendered resolution on any of your monitors, whether it's 27 inch 1080p 1440 or 4K, affect performance of your Mac? From me, I use a 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro, and from what I've experienced, there's hardly any lag or any change. And when it comes to GPU performance and Geekbench scores, the results are more or less constant. It's very hard to notice any difference whether I'm using the default 1080p panel on a 4K monitor or if I'm to render that monitor to 1440p. It doesn't really affect my workflow, and I do a lot of Photoshop, I do a lot of video editing using Final Cut Pro, so I wouldn't say I all the time exhaust all the resources and RAM and GPU and CPU of my Mac, but at the same time I wouldn't say I'm a light user on my Mac, because sometimes I have different tabs open. I have Photoshop, I have Final Cut Pro, so I'm a fairly heavy user myself, and I haven't seen or noticed any noticeable effects on my device. It seems like if you have a Mac device that has an Apple Silicon chip or newer, then definitely the effects of this are going to be very minimal. Yes, you are going to get a message that using a scaled resolution will at times affect performance, but it's very rare on an Apple Silicon chip. Maybe if you're on an Intel chip, then that's when I would think twice, before using a scaled resolution. At the same time, there's a very big misconception that people think that if you are using a scaled resolution, for example, on a 4K monitor and you scale it to 1440p at 60 hertz, people think that all the user interface and elements are being rendered 60 times a second, which is not the case. Once macOS has mapped the widescreen of the different UI elements and window sizes, then it doesn't need to keep doing this in the background. If it kept doing this 60 frames per second as you are doing the different changes and resizing and opening different applications, even on an Apple Silicon chip, your Mac would definitely take a big hit. And then that's not the case, and that's why performance hit when it comes to CPU is non-existent, and when it comes to the GPU there's almost no effect as well. You might also be wondering why macOS scales 4K, 5K and 6K monitors but not 1440p and 1080p panel. As we saw, 1080p displays by default to 1080p, 1440p at 27 inch displays by default to 1440p, but 4K is scaled to 1080p. And the reason why macOS does that, like we saw, is if macOS by default was to set a 27 inch 4K monitor to display 4K, which is 2160, you definitely need a magnifying glass to be able to see, and so that's why 4K is scaled to 1080p, and then 5K as well is scaled to 1440p. Even 6K on the Pro Display XDR is scaled, but on a 1440p and a 1080p panel, the pixel density of the monitor is usually closer to standard displays, which means that the text and icons are already in comfortable view size for readability and usability. And because of this, macOS might not apply the same scaling that it uses on 4K monitors compared to 1440p or 1080p panels. After all this is said and done, which monitor would you be buying, or would I recommend if I was to do this all over again? For a certainty, I can say that the 4K monitor is the best in all situations. If you are looking for a monitor that has the best clearest quality, then the 4K monitor is the best. If you set your 4K monitor to the UI to look like 1440p. It's going to be sharper than a native 1440p displaying 1440p. The 4K monitor has the most clear text. It has the most clarity of all these monitors. But then keep in mind that when it comes to 4K monitors, and if you're a person that prioritizes refresh rate over resolution, 4K monitors, there's very limited selection of monitors that you can get above 120 hertz, and most 4K monitors like the one I was showing in this video is limited to 4K 60 hertz, which is okay if you're just using, you know, photo editing and office uses. But then if you're trying to get like 250, or even some monitors on 1440p have 500 hertz refresh rate, which is something that's like mind-blowing. And for macOS, I don't know what you'd be doing to try and get the 500 frames per second, but the 1440p monitor has an advantage in refresh rate or frames per second. But then also, if you were to go around the 120 hertz or even the 250 hertz on a 1440p panel, prices tend to be in the same proximity when it comes to 4K 60 versus a 1440p at around 180 to 220 refresh rate. So it depends on what you prioritize more, whether you want FPS or you want resolution. And at the same time, for if you're a person that wants the cheapest, you know, the one that's budget friendly, then it's very hard to recommend, I think, in this day and age, a 1080p panel, because the 1440p panel set to 1080p UI is going to look sharper than a 1080p monitor set to 1080p by default. So in all situations, at least for me, in my case, I'm going to be sticking with the 4K 27-inch panel, because even if I was to set it to 1440p or to 1080p, it's going to give me the best and clearest result without having to take a hit on performance. So that's just my quick 2 cents. At the same time, I know there's different applications out there like Better Display and so on that have an option to allow you to see clearer text, but then essentially what they are doing is selecting the option that doesn't say low resolution or that has the high DPI dots per inch, which gives you more clearer text. But that's just the same as if you were to go in the menu section yourself and selecting that option. So basically that's about it for me when it comes to my quick 2 cents on these 4K 1440p and 1080p monitor discussions. Hopefully it's simplified everything for you and will be sort of a guide when it comes to guiding you to which monitor to get for your Mac. And that's about it for me. Leave any questions that you might have in the comment section below, and if you haven't subscribed, definitely do hit subscribe and join the family, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.